Thanks. So thank you for having me, and thanks for showing up. It's my birthday today, so you're all on my birthday party. Thank you so much. Thank you. I guess I was asking for that. Thank you. Do I need to do something for the slide to come up, or is it automagic? It's automagic. Yes, so I'm David. I'm the Executive Director Experience Design for Europe, for AKQA. I'll really briefly talk about who we are, for those of you who don't know us. We're a global design agency. We have a bunch of offices, about 2,000 people worldwide in Europe, America, and Asia. We're still growing. Next week I'm going to Copenhagen to welcome the newest member of our family and find out what they're all about. So we're still going strong. But really, the easiest way to introduce any agency is with a little bit of loud video. So let's just start with that. Everybody's awake? So I want to talk a little bit about the future and about designing for the future. We say about ourselves that we exist to create the future with our clients. And we mean that, we're serious about that. We often refer to William Gibson, who has this wonderful quote that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And when you think about it, that's really true. If you think about things like artificial intelligence, virtual worlds, robots, quantum computing, it all sounds incredibly futuristic and like it's from a movie. But actually, it's already here. It's being used. It's being applied. And our job is to try and identify those technologies and identify how we can make those technologies work and to democratize them, to bring them into the realm of the possible and of the desirable. So, and that always means that you have to come up with a bit of a bigger idea. You can't just say, well, let's do something fun with Oculus Rift. There has to be a point to it. There has to be a reason why you want to use that new technology, and there has to be a driving idea behind that sort of harmonizes everything. And in the case of, for instance, KLM, one of our big clients in Amsterdam, we started, the question was, can you improve our app? And any of those of you who have traveled with KLM a few years ago will have known that that app was really quite terrible. And so in a way, it's pretty easy to innovate and to improve on that. But really, if you want to zoom out a little bit and take more of a vision, there's a lot more you can do, because really the way we approached this was that we said, conceptually, we want to think of the relationship between KLM and their clients as a combination of what we know about people who are traveling or at some point in their journey continuum, and what we know about KLM and all the services and all the things that KLM offers during that whole travel experience. And once we identify all those data points and we can start to connect them in a smart way and in a personalized way, then actually it's more of an ecosystem proposition than let's say an app that you need to make. So when we started on the app, we really tried to think about it more from a data perspective, and as a result, we worked really hard and long with KLM to turn all their services into APIs that we could connect with, and that allowed us to then roll out that whole customer experience across lots of different touch points, from the mobile app to tablet to the Apple Watch, the kiosks, the website. Everything is one single experience, and wherever you are and whenever you are in your travel journey, that touch point will flex itself to you and will give you the most relevant information at that point in time. Because if you're a few days out from travel, then maybe you want to dream about the destination that you're going to. But if you're a few minutes from travel, then all you need to know is, where's my gate right now? Do I have my my boarding pass? And so for technology to take away the stress and the having to search for the right bits of information is really a great way to rethink the digital customer journey. Another example, this is a little bit older because right now VR is really becoming much more of a mainstream product, but we worked with Oculus as one of their very early partners to develop this product for Nissan. And we used it at the Tokyo Motor Show to let people create their own car in virtual reality. And the interesting thing there, and the twist there, was not just the glitzy experience at the motor show where we had long queues of people waiting. We had to do some product design as well, some industrial design to create a new physical version of the Oculus that could be used by lots of different people, that could easily be swapped out so people didn't have somebody else's sweaty thing on their face. And all the innovations that people came up with, all the design ideas that people came up with for their version of their favorite Nissan, then were also brought into the development and the production process for Nissan. So it's a way not only to demonstrate the new vehicles, but also to get input from consumers as to what they would like to see next. If we think about interfaces, one of the really big shifts, and any of you who has seen the movie Her, will at least hopefully had the same feeling that I had, where I bought immediately into that vision of the future that Her presented. It felt really, really credible, not just in terms of the voice interface, but just the whole way that had been set up. The color scheme is really, I thought, an amazing example of how you can think about the near future and come up with a really credible vision, and that's something that we try to do as well. Now voice is going into the mainstream more, and so we've worked with Jamie Oliver on creating an Alexa skill, so people can just get recipe inspiration in their home just talking to Alexa. And you might have already noticed in the reel that we created this huge LED basketball court, an interactive basketball court, which was initially to do promotion for Nike basketball. Nike's one of our oldest clients. They've been with us for about 17 years, I believe. We've done a lot of work for them. We continue to do a lot of work with them. And this project was to activate a very engaged and hyped up Chinese basketball crowd. We worked with Kobe Bryant and LeBron James. They came over to China to work with selected individuals who then got onto this court. And of course, it was a big spectacle. You could use the court to identify patterns. They created shoes that were connected so that you knew where everybody was on the court. And then in the next phase, we turned that into a training tool for trainers. Of course, you can't build an LED basketball court everywhere. So how can you then use that technology and the learnings that we've taken to create a training tool that was part of an app that coaches could use to train young people? So I guess that's the first sort of overarching principle maybe. If you're going to design for the future, if you're going to democratize the future, if you're going to try to evenly distribute the future, then you need to think a little bit bigger. And I've been thinking in my role, I think a lot about the design process. I think a lot about how we formalize, how can we create or productize almost this approach, whilst at the same time, leaving room for things to be different for each client. And this, you will never believe this, but this comes actually from an early Apple research group. This was their model for design. They said, well, somebody comes with an idea, we do something, and then the money follows. That was the early way of designing for technology. There wasn't really that much rigor in the design approach. People literally just did stuff, and then stuff happened. And as we all know, or those of you who are old enough like me to remember the earlier days of technology, that meant that technology was super random, and some of it was amazing, and some of it was really, really shit. Actually, a lot of it was pretty shit. So over time, design philosophies began to emerge, and you guys will all be familiar with design thinking as the foremost design tool, which was, it's actually pretty old already. It's from the early 90s, where the first design thinking started to be formalized, and then turned also into a business tool by IDEO. So they realized that the way you can design products, actually, a lot of the principles there also apply to the way that you design businesses. Business traditionally is driven very much by long-term planning and long-term strategy, and you have a boardroom full of gray-haired guys who think about what the future is going to be like and how they need to plan for that, and then they make a really big plan, and then they find some money, and then that money is invested, and by the time the plan's executed, you're 2, 3, 5 years into the future, and the world's changed, it's no longer relevant. So if you're going to design, especially for a digital age, then you need to really be able to work much faster and much more intuitively, but without the early version of that where everybody just does something and we'll see what comes out the other end. And so design thinking as a methodology really started to be formalized to go really quickly from, and I'll just recap for those of you who are not incredibly familiar with this, but just really briefly, you need to start with really understanding your end user. So you need to really go deep into what are you trying to actually achieve. Then you can quickly start to define those insights and bring them closer together and identify what you want to really go for. Then you go wide again, so this is the double diamond idea, where you start ideating, coming up with lots of different possible solutions, and then you use prototyping to go more into definition again and test your hypotheses, test whether you think whether the solution is actually going to work. And so I've been thinking about how can we take this theory and take it one step further in the context of what we do. Especially because what we do is really a combination of creative and business. We really, when you start creating digital products like, for instance, the KLM example that I gave before, you're really so close to the core business. It's no longer a marketing department and you do a nice little campaign and that just goes live and that's that. When you start to really work on products, it means that you're very, very close to what the business really stands for and what the core relationship is between the business and the users. So I started to imagine what the next version of design thinking might be. And of course, as an experienced designer, I think it looks a bit like this. And the reason why I think there's room for a wider, or let's say a new definition of design thinking is because it allows us to be a bit more fine-tuned. We can create some very specific properties that allow us to design more quickly, more effectively. And I'm going to talk through those examples with you. So this is a working hypothesis. It might be that we think it's different, but so far it works pretty well. If you think about design thinking in general, can be applied to anything from a table and chairs to a digital to a film. Experienced design thinking is a little bit narrower, it's a bit more explicit. It always starts with digital technology. Everything that we do, at least at AKQA, has always a digital connection. We come from a place where we were probably one of the first agencies to really understand the power of digital for communication, But now everybody understands that now, and communication is to a large extent digital in any case. So how can we take the paradigms of digital and apply those more to products and to going deeper into the business? So we start from technology. The second point that I think that I keep coming back to, and therefore it becomes a principle, is that experience design is always an ecosystem approach. So there's always a holistic perspective that you need to take, because as you all know, we're all digital consumers. We don't go to a website and then everything that we need to do there, from understanding the proposition to maybe buying something, happens in that one visit on that one touch point. It's always a combination of touch points. You come back, you go away, you go somewhere else, you find, you know, you need the next part of the story, the next part of the experience. So considering whatever you're making from an ecosystem perspective is really core. And then, as I mentioned, if you start to do that, then you're actually almost always automatically touching the business. You're really getting into under the hood of what the business is all about. And so and not only do you start to influence it, but you also end up very often in what we call business transformation conversations, where actually the way this plan and this experience that we're creating for consumers has such a big impact on the business that really there's a lot of things that we need to change and we need to reconsider. So we're finding ourselves becoming, as well as a digital agency, also more of a consultancy. And I work quite a lot together with our Italian office, where we have a business strategy team. And we really pick that up together. So business strategy understands the financials, the market impact, how do you reposition yourself, how do you price things up differently, and so forth. And then from our end, we say, okay, what does that look like? So that's how we do it. And the funny thing is that when you start to think about new stuff and exciting new ways of doing things, then sooner or later you always realize that you're doing something that somebody has actually been doing for a while, and in this case, Buckminster Fuller, who's been around, who was already around long before I started to think about any of this stuff, or any of us, already said that a designer is an emerging synthesis of artist, inventor, mechanic, objective economist, and evolutionary strategist. It's a beautiful way of putting it. But this really broad and holistic way of understanding design as part of a bigger system and as part of something that has a really deep impact on what we're doing was already around then. And actually, it's cool that we're sitting in this dome. It's not quite a Buckminster Fuller dome, but nevertheless reminiscent. So if you buy into this, and please buy into this for now, like let's just assume that this is a thing, then the way I would break this down is 5 sort of starting points, 5 conclusions that I've and that we as a team have come to that really help inform the design process. The first is that people will never really tell you what they want. Another famous quote that all of you will probably be familiar with is the quote by Henry Ford, who said that if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. It's slightly overused, but it's such an amazing quote because it's exactly what happens. If you ask people what they want, then they always start to think from their existing context, and it's very difficult to innovate if you're only thinking about the existing context. So, but at the same time, you should really ask people what they want, because otherwise you're just making up your own shit, and you really need to understand who you're doing this for. If you go back to the empathy point of design thinking, so how can you ask people questions and get meaningful answers, meaningful insights that still allow you to transcend the now, transcend what's happening now? That's the first problem. The second is that you always need to design in context, and this goes back to the ecosystem point I was making before. So you can't look at a problem in isolation. You always need to zoom out and think, what else is going on around this issue? The third principle is that if we design for people, then we need to understand and remember that people are not actually that rational when it comes down to it. We like to think of ourselves as extremely rational, and of course we have the capacity for rational thought, but we are, to an incredibly large extent, maybe more than 90% of our decisions are driven by subconscious processes and by emotional considerations. And so if you're going to create any kind of experience, then you need to think about the emotional as well as the functional needs. The fourth thing goes back to my intense dislike of wireframes, which for an experienced designer maybe is a bit counterintuitive, but wireframes really don't work. I would recommend any of you to not make any wireframes ever again, other than maybe as a sketch. You know, if you want to just quickly sketch something, we can call that a wireframe, fine. But don't make wireframes because they're stupid. Nobody looks at them, nobody understands them. If you give a wireframe to a designer, they go, oh, and they just make their own thing anyway. So really what you want to do is get into prototyping as quickly as possible and try and do that together with visual designers. This idea of art and logic working together and really quickly getting into something that is actually real, that looks a lot like what you're aiming for, is way more efficient than doing it in 2 phases where you first have an abstract, a grayscale version, and then you go and design it. It doesn't work. In my experience, it doesn't work. And wherever we've moved, wherever I've worked, where we've moved from wireframes to prototypes, there's always been an enormous increase in efficiency and effectiveness. And then the 5th point is about going back to the business impact. So if you start to design for the future, and if you start to design for new experiences, then you're going to run into constraints. The business doesn't necessarily work that way. They've never really done it that way. So you need to first of all, understand those constraints. Then you need to challenge them because you need to push through that, because otherwise nothing's ever going to really change. But if you try and ignore them and just create something that is beautiful and that will be amazing, but you don't understand what the impact is on the business, it's never going to really come to fruition. It's never really going to grow up. So you need to play chess on 2 boards and understand what's happening at the front end has an impact on the back end. And I'm going to show you 5 tools that we use to deal with these problems. The first is context mapping, and it's a way to understand what motivates people. What is the deeper behavior that's driving people's decision making? Second is an ecosystem architecture, which is about understanding the greater context. The third is an experience flow. Fourth is prototyping, as I mentioned, and the fifth, is a service blueprint. I'm running through them quickly because I'm going to dive into each of these. So context mapping, first of all. Now, this is something that I came across years ago. It was done by, or is invented by an assistant professor at Delft University, TU Delft, Vrouwtje Sleeswijk-Visser. I was at one of those service design meetups, and she was talking about context mapping, and I thought, this sounds amazing. So I tried to apply it in my own work and found it really works. And so now it's become a standard go-to methodology to understand deeper motivations. So for one client, the business problem that we were trying to solve is they were trying to tap into a completely new audience that they didn't really know anything about. And you can do some desk research and you can find out what is the behavior and what's happening in the world, and you should do all that, but really context mapping is a great way to get under the hood. So how it works is you start with a process called sensitization. And sensitization is basically diary keeping. So what you're doing is you're taking about a week out of somebody's life and you give them a diary. We use these days an app for that called CrowdLab. And you can just put a bunch of questions in. People can take photos, they can take audio or video snippets. And you really ask them, you create a series of exercises that is designed to get them to think really deeply about their experience. Their experience in the context of the thing that you're trying to figure out. So this was about sports. It could also be about, we've done it for cooking. So it doesn't matter what the domain is, but you really want to get people to really start to consider their own behavior, because you don't do that in your daily life. You just get on with stuff and you don't really think about what am I doing here and why am I doing that. So that's the first part, and it's designed to turn people into what we call an expert of their own experience. Then you get everybody together in a room and you start a co-creation session. So the point here is to try and take all those learnings that they have about their own experience and bring them out, but both in a verbal and in an explicit way, but also in a non-verbal and a more subconscious way. So it's lots of exercises that are designed to get people to draw and build and design things. And the way that they design it, or the types of problems that they're trying to solve with their design, helps you understand the deeper motivation behind it, because sometimes they're not able to articulate what they're trying to achieve, but they can build something, and the point is not to look at their design because they're not designers, but the point is to understand what is the motivation behind that design. And then what you do is analysis, so everything that happens on that evening is transcribed, turned into words. We print that out a few times, and we give that to different people who are part of the team. They go through it, and they highlight with a different color marker which bits they thought were interesting. So what are the things that are coming out that we need to dig deeper into, and then you compare them. You hang them all up. So you do that individually, and then you hang them all up on the wall, and you can see, oh, we all thought that this bit was interesting. So then you can start to zoom into that a little bit, and it's a way to try to start to extract these insights from what happened on the day. And it's a really great way to get to a bunch of different insights. So traditional agencies go with a big insight, and it tends, I think, to be almost always quite bullshitty, but it sounds really great, and then you can come up with a creative concept, a big idea, and that works really well for campaigns and so forth, but it doesn't work so well for products. So getting many deeper, more interesting insights that you can maybe connect together to come up with additional ideas, I think is a much more interesting way to take learnings from your audience. Okay, so let's move on to ecosystem architecture. The business problem that we were trying to solve recently for a client is they were a fintech startup, and they had a mature product. It was out there in the market, but they really needed to scale up really, really quickly. So this was more of a marketing context. But again, we can use this for instance, e-commerce or whatever. Almost every solution or every problem we can use this for. And what we do is we identify all the different touch points. We analyze traffic. We look at hard data, and we look at all the different channels. In this case, I've blurred it out a little bit because it's not really relevant, but also this is all confidential. But you can see the principles here, right? So you can see what we're trying to do. So on the left-hand side, you can see the value proposition and the principles. So sometimes that's a whole workshop on it by itself, where you understand what actually are you offering, what's your core value proposition. And then we looked at the jobs to be done. If you're familiar with the value proposition canvas, it's kind of a business strategy tool. You can start to extract the types of things that people are trying to achieve, and then you can start to map how does that, how does our product answer those questions? How do these jobs get met? And then you can start to prioritize. There's some things that we want to do earlier on in the customer life cycle and some things that we want to do later. Then you can move across and start to think about this from a touchpoint perspective. So within the customer journey, from awareness through to purchase and post-purchase, what are all the different channels that we should be using for this particular audience? What's the value that we're promising on those different points? Because if you want to, in this case, it's a fintech company, so they have quite a difficult product to explain in 3 words. So you need to only explain maybe part of it if you're just trying to grab people's attention, and then when you're interacting with them, then maybe you can explain the next part. You can't just say all the features that this product has, because people will tune out, especially when it comes to financial stuff. And you can also use this to create some opportunities to do some ideation. So these are very much interactive sessions that you do together with the client to try and draw out what are all the possible ways that we can connect to the customer. And then finally, we looked at their own ecosystem, so all their owned and earned and paid channels. And again, you can start to prioritize to say, well, we have a finite amount of money. We don't want to boil the ocean. We don't want to do everything at once. So what do we start with, and then what do we do later? And you can start to show how we want to have traffic, the main traffic flows. Where do people come in? Where do we need to send them to, and so forth. And that allows you to then come up with a prioritized high-level roadmap to say, okay, let's focus on this touch point first. And once you've done that, you can use an experience flow to then dive deep. So the question that you're answering here is, what are the emotional and the functional needs of people? I mentioned before, the tendency for interaction designers and information architects has always been to think about what people need to achieve. So what's the functional tasks that people need to do? And you can do that, but you don't get a full experience unless you also think about, how do people feel? Are they maybe a little bit wary, or they don't really trust you yet? Or maybe they're a bit hesitant because they need to part with their money, or maybe they're excited because you're talking about something that really, that's really connects with who they are and what they're all about. And so an experience flow, and again, is something that you make together with a client, helps you to map from moment to moment, as you take people through a specific journey, what that starts to look like. This is actually already a year old, but I was talking about this again with this client in Paris earlier this week, because they're a big client and they move slowly. But that's just the nature. That's just the nature of it. If you're a startup, you can do things really, really quickly. If you're a big corporate, it takes a long time, and it's very counterintuitive. It's an amazing project, this, because these guys bought a startup. It was effectively a defensive move because they thought, oh my God, these guys are doing something that threatens our business, so let's just buy them, and then we'll figure out later what we're going to do with them. And they sat on it for a while. They spent a few million on it, and they sat on it for a while, and then they thought, we really need to do something with this, because otherwise we just paid for it, and we just neutralized them, but we can actually use this. So that's where we then come in and start to think with them, okay, what does that look like? We went to Israel, where the startup was based, to really understand the technology behind it. You can see here some mysterious objects. It's a hardware product as well as a software product. And so gradually you can start to draw out, okay, what are all the things that we need to achieve in each of the steps? What are the KPIs where we can measure success? So is somebody actually progressing through this flow? Is somebody going further and further? And then you can immediately start to create requirements, functional, non-functional requirements. And this is a great alternative to wireframes, right? Where you have to think about a lot of detail immediately. Here you can still zoom out and still consider overall what am I trying to achieve? So what's the happy flow? Later on you can worry about where it goes wrong and errors and all that stuff. But this is just, okay, what is the core experience? And then you can start to write down, okay, it needs to be able to do this. From the design perspective, we need to make sure that it feels like this. So you can start to really quickly extract high-level requirements. And then you can move into prototyping. You can immediately go from this to building a prototype. And prototyping is anything from paper and pencil and just, scribbling some stuff down and putting them in a right order and showing them to people and saying, does this make sense? All the way to, we use Framer sometimes, which is very detailed. You can make beautiful animations, looks fantastic, looks like the real thing. And even at that high fidelity level, you can start to really quickly get to conclusions. And quickly, maybe not compared to wireframes, but quickly definitely compared to building, because if you actually have to code something, that takes a lot longer than to prototype it. So you can start to validate your assumptions. It's also a great tool to show to the client, this is the cool thing that we're building, right? And to get them enthusiastic and to get them to keep an eye on the ball, because these things always take long. Like a campaign, again, that's something, you could probably create in a matter of weeks or months. A product tends to take years. So you need to keep your clients, your stakeholders, bought in, and a prototype can really help with that. This is an example of a prototype that we made for a client where it was an e-commerce project, and we really wanted to try some innovative ways of doing e-commerce. So what you see here is maybe rather than having all these different photos and little thumbnails, and you click on the thumbnail and then you see a different picture, we thought, well, what if you could just zoom down the page, like scroll down the page, and it automatically zooms in and out and highlights the different points. We also wanted to remove the barrier between a product page and a grid, so they're actually just a zoomed out or zoomed in state, so it feels much more fluid. It doesn't feel like a very complicated site architecture. And you could see at the right top there that there's this little icon with questions that automatically pop out. And that was really the big idea here, is to try and use chat or conversational interfaces throughout the e-commerce experience. So actually, can we replace all aspects of navigation with chat? Now that sounds counterintuitive, feels really difficult to do, and as it turned out, we shouldn't do that, so that's why it's so great to make a prototype, because you can then really feel it and say, well, actually this is where we really run into trouble, so maybe this part we should turn into more traditional navigation, but we can still continue to use the principle of it, and you can start to see that it's a very fluid experience where you move from more, let's say, browsing and figuring out which suit is right for me, into sort of seamlessly into a checkout flow where you can then order And this is also where you can really imagine what an impact this has on the business, because this is so service-led. Like you can get an AI to do some of this stuff. You can build this so that a lot of this is automated, but you also need people in this equation. So that means that suddenly they need to, and they already had a customer service team, but how can we retrain them and put them in a position where they can be, let's say, the human part of this interaction. And you can also see here that it seamlessly moves from web to app. In this case, an app where you can take that experience of buying a suit, and it doesn't matter what touch point you're on. The touch point knows who you are, where you are in the journey, and then can continue to help you. Now, some of this makes a lot of sense. You can test it, you can get feedback, and it works. Some of it is awesome, but it just doesn't work in reality. It's just not practical. The data isn't there. And some of it was outright bullshit, and we shouldn't do it. And really, you can get to some of those conclusions if you go lo-fi, but if you really try and make it look like at least close to what it's going to look like in real life, then that's the full experience, because we're all visual beings. It's important how something looks. So this is a great example of how prototypes can really help you get to a lot of conclusions really quickly, or a lot of assumptions that you've started with. You can start to validate those. And then finally, the service blueprint is a tool that we use to really understand, okay, what actually is the impact on the business. So a client here was a Turkish client, a big telecom company in Turkey. They really wanted to change their whole business because, well, it goes too much detail, but we started by creating this end experience for them. Okay, what is your customer going to experience completely differently from now? But then what does that actually mean for your organization? Because there's a whole bunch of stuff that you need to change. This is not just about a website that you see at the top there, but there's also a call center involved, there's account managers involved, there's maybe a physical store, there's chat, there's a CRM and email. So there's lots of different channels, and they all interact. They all together basically deliver that experience across the top for consumers, and you can see the needs and the emotions coming back there as well. So these tools all sort of connect to each other. You can use the ecosystem map to identify all the different touch points, so the ecosystem architecture. You can then use the experience flow to focus in on one of those touch points and identify the needs. And then you just use that as the top bit. That's your end experience. And then you can show here, okay, what's the impact on the organization? What are all the different things that we need to do? What are the projects that fall out of this? Who are the people that we need to involve in this change management? What technology do we need to put in place? Maybe it already exists, maybe it needs to be new. And then we abstracted that into a more simple form so that you can see the projects, people, and technology. You can then create some lists. So there are the strategic principles at the top, and then the different projects, the different people, technology. You can then prioritize and say, these are the things that we need to do first because they're really important for the business, but they're also doable from a technology standpoint, and these other things, maybe they're also really important, but they're really hard, and it takes some time to build the infrastructure for it. And then you can start to just simply lay that out as a roadmap. High level, of course, you need a lot more detail before you can start building, but this is a really great way because we were speaking directly with the CMO and the CEO, and that's a different type of client than a marketeer that you're making something for. So to get these really simplified diagrams which show, okay, this is the experience, this is what that means, and this is what the impact is for your business, and this is how it rolls out over time, for them is a really great way to say, okay, I buy into this. So that's how we use the service blueprint. So to sum it all up, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I'm hoping I'm almost out of time because I'm almost done. Just to recap, so context mapping is a great way to understand what motivates your users. How can you get under the skin of people's behaviors and desires? An ecosystem architecture then allows you to zoom out and understand holistically what we're trying to achieve. The experience flow allows you to zoom in and say, what are the functional requirements actually, and the non-functional requirements. Then you build it as quickly as possible, just make it work in some ways, take it to real people, test it, validate it, change, iterate quickly. And then as you take that, or sometimes before you take that to the technology people who are going to build the whole thing, you can use the service blueprint to see what the impact is on the business. And finally, very importantly, as I said in the beginning, this is a work in progress. These are our conclusions, and I want to share them with you, but they're never absolute. And even in our day-to-day work, we constantly change, iterate, adapt, add new deliverables, add new processes, because every project is different. Sometimes I have to learn about private banking. Sometimes I have to learn about hair color and salons. Sometimes I'm thinking about sports. Every time you're in a new business, you're in a new domain. And we don't need to understand the entire domain. We just need to understand how to design and then bring that domain knowledge in from the client. So that means that things change over time, things adapt, and it's very important to stay flexible and to do whatever works for you. So I have one more slide, which I gave this talk before at FITC earlier this year, and somebody made this, which I thought was awesome. So if you want to remember any of this, then take a photo of this, and hopefully it'll tell the whole story in a single slide. And in the meantime, I want to say thank you very much for listening, and have fun in the rest of the conference. Thank you. Thanks.